Hi, it's Mel again, and this is How We Homeschool. This is part 5 in our 6-video series on the major homeschooling styles. Part 5 is going to be mainly concerned with unschooling. Unschooling is probably one of the most controversial of the homeschooling methods, the major homeschooling styles, and that's for 2 reasons. Okay, so reason number 1 would be most people hear unschooling and they assume that what you mean is basically you're not really educating your children at all. Which is not the case, of course. The other real issue or controversy with unschooling is that a lot of people who do unschool or classify their style as unschooling, they don't really necessarily agree on the best way to do it. It's not a one size fits all sort of method. It just doesn't do that. So, that being said, unschooling, the name, comes from essentially its basis as a reaction against those modern brick and mortar schooling approaches. Okay, so it does have some structure, especially when it comes to those foundational subjects like reading, writing, math. Like, everybody recognizes that you need to have some experience in all of those subjects, some level of expertise in all of those subjects in order to be successful in life. So unschooling parents are not parents that just have no interest in teaching their children. But this method does take a certain degree of pride in the freeform nature that's involved in all of their learning. So it's very, very hard to nail down this particular style, mainly because it's essentially determined by what it's not, which is the traditional modern schooling approach. And every family tends to do things their own way. They sort of get a feel for what works for their kids individually and just do that. Now, in general, it's usually a child-led, interest-led sort of strategy. And it allows each student to sort of delve as deeply into their interests as they possibly can, essentially. So a parent would generally encourage them to ask as many questions as they can and teach the children essentially how to find the answers to those questions, which is not a bad approach. But it usually incorporates a lot of life experiences, a lot of hands-on learning, plenty of library books, because you never know from one month to the next what's going to catch your child's fancy. So this style of learning in general will appeal to people who are already skeptical of the school systems and the approaches that they already have in place. If you dislike the pitfalls of like memorization and regurgitation that can very frequently happen in school, or it can lead to a child essentially forgetting any of the unused knowledge that they've collected over the years. If you have children who already tend to be self-motivated, if they already tend to create their own learning experiences, or create their own projects, like taking it upon themselves to learn new recipes in the kitchen, or if they have such an avid interest in pirates that they take it to the extent of learning the history of piracy and learning shipbuilding techniques, then this might really be a very good fit for you, actually. The drawbacks of this method really are already sort of obvious. If it's left completely unstructured, completely unsupervised, obviously this can lead to eventual gaps in knowledge. So it is sort of up to a parent to monitor what's being learned and ensure that as they grow, as they get further along in their education, that they are filling in those gaps and concentrating on any areas of weakness, okay? The other issue that can come up occasionally is that if for whatever reason you decide you need to put your child back into school, it can be a little bit tricky if you've been unschooling, particularly if you've been unschooling for several years. It can be hard to fit them into an exact grade level because you may not have been following the general guidelines laid out by the Department of Education, right? Now, obviously, there is some like testing and assessment that can happen before you put your child back into school, so that's not necessarily an issue, especially if the school that you send them to is willing to be somewhat flexible with regard to their general skills. But that being said, even if you're unschooling, you are learning most of the basics of math, reading, writing, so it shouldn't be a major difficult transition. I don't know a lot of unschoolers that actually decide to put their children into school in general, like barring some kind of emergency where they find themselves completely unable to homeschool anymore for reasons unrelated to schooling itself. Now, it can also be difficult for a child who's really not self-motivated or who thrives on the greater structure, on implemented schedules, or they thrive on competition, but you don't necessarily have other children around that are available to compete on their level. That can be a drawback. So, again, that's not to say that you cannot implement some kind of structure or implement some degree of competition between your children, some sort of challenge in order to motivate them to push themselves further. But it's going to be very, very self-determined according to whatever's deemed appropriate and useful within the family. So that is unschooling in a nutshell. I will be back with part 6 of this video series that's going to be basically our catch-all video on eclectic styles, on Waldorf styles, on various others. Okay, so that is it for part 5, and this is how we homeschool.